Hey everyone, welcome back to the feed. Now the last time we were together we were looking at aquatic biomes and before that terrestrial biomes. Now something I didn't talk about a lot that was underlying all of those biome studies is the availability of nutrients. And nutrients and nutrient cycles are an important part of understanding how ecosystems are set up and how life shows up and how much life you have. So there are key nutrients that cycle through every ecosystem, and how quickly they cycle through and how much is available will dictate how much plant growth there is. And again, plant growth or productivity dictates biodiversity. So the more flow, the more available nutrients, you have more plants growing, which means you have more animals, more biodiverse. Right? Now there are a few key nutrients that we're going to be looking at. We're looking at carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and water, or the hydrologic cycle. Now there are other nutrients that are important, and some would argue just as important. Potassium is one of them, but we're not going to cover them here. Now, without further ado, let's dive in. Alright, so I lied. There's one thing we have to talk about before we talk about the nutrient cycles, and there are three key terms. So the first one is this word source. Now a source is any organism, any object, any activity that releases a nutrient into a system. And the system in this case would be the environment. A sink is the same thing, like a organism or an object or some process that takes in and uses that nutrient. And then finally you have a reservoir. And a reservoir in this case works the same way as it does in the real world with a water reservoir. Interesting enough, we're talking about the water cycle in a little bit. Anyway, the reservoir is something that stores a nutrient for a long period of time. And long is a relative statement here because for humans it could be a lifetime or more, and in terms of geologic time it's momentary or longer. So keep that in mind. So these three terms we have to keep square in our heads as we talk about our nutrient cycles. So we have source, sink, and reservoir. Now let's begin looking at the cycles. Okay. Starting with a little bit of basics here, the carbon cycle. What you have to understand is the carbon cycle really centers around two processes that you've been learning in science class forever, and that's photosynthesis and aerobic respiration or cellular respiration. Those two processes dictate most of the carbon cycle. You have to understand that carbon is a fairly minor player in the atmosphere. It's only 0.04% of it, but the more carbon there is, more carbon dioxide really, or carbon monoxide or methane, the more carbon's present, the warmer things get, which we should all know at this point, and the less CO2 present, the cooler things get. Now, as I said, the main reservoir for carbon would be the atmosphere. That's where most of it's going to be stored, or at least the most usable form of it's going to be stored. There are other reservoirs, and those being dissolved in water. So if you're a fan of soda or seltzer, the fizz is carbon dioxide dissolved in water. It's chemistry, right? So water can dissolve CO2. The more CO2 in the atmosphere, the more dissolved CO2 in the ocean, FYI. Now, just like on land, plants in the water will take in carbon dioxide as part of photosynthesis, store it as their tissues, and either die or get eaten, and then that transfers along. Given enough time, the CO2 or the carbon stored in their cells and their bodies will precipitate down to the ocean floor or lake bottom, and the carbon builds up there, and then you have the other large reservoir, which would be sediments and rocks. And that's how it usually is. And then falling underneath that is everyone's favorite carbon source, fossil fuels. So, those are our main reservoirs. We have the atmosphere, we have dissolved in water, any water, and we have stored in rocks and sediments, especially ocean rocks and sediments. Now, sinks of carbon would be photosynthesis. So photosynthesis here for plants or single-celled phytoplankton in the ocean or algae, that's where the source is. Sink, on the other hand, mostly, is cellular respiration. All right? You exhaling releases carbon into the atmosphere where it's pulled in by plants and we go around and around and around. Decomposition as well is part of that, because the bacteria breaking down dead things give off carbon as well. Humans mess this up, or influence, I should say, be a little more appropriate, but mess up, when we start burning things. And combustion, in any form, is basically just cellular respiration. It's almost the exact same chemical makeup. You get almost the same byproducts. You have the same reactants, right? When you burn fossil fuels or you burn wood or anything like that, you are releasing carbon that has been stored in a sink or a reservoir. You're releasing it suddenly and rapidly, and you're adding it to the system. So now the system is amplifying. And this goes for any kind of fire, and wildfires do the same thing, but those are natural systems. Humans burn stuff on a massive scale: fossil fuels, oil, natural gas, coal, and we burn wood and other organic compounds and biomass pretty regularly too. So that's the carbon cycle in a nutshell. All right, again, focus on the main thing. It's an interaction between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Moving on to nitrogen. Okay, nitrogen cycle. This one's probably the most complex of the four that we're going to look at, because there's so many moving parts. The reservoir in this case that we really need to keep in mind is the atmosphere. The atmosphere makes up most of the reservoir, most of where it's stored. Most of the air you're breathing right now is gaseous nitrogen, N2. And N2 is not usable by most forms of life. Plants, animals cannot use nitrogen in the air, so just breathing does not add nitrogen to your body to be used. Microbes play a really, really important role. All right, so let's follow this along. So again, nitrogen makes up the main part, the main reservoir, or nitrogen in the air, I should say. What you have what's called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Now, they can live in the nodules of roots, and it's literally like warts on the roots of plants, especially peas and legumes. And those bacteria take gaseous nitrogen and turn it into ammonium and ammonia, which are some of the main forms that we need to use here. So ammonium ions are important, as are nitrates. Anyway, so we have our nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil or in these roots, creating in a usable form for plants. Now, you get nitrification going on also with microbes, and that gives you nitrites, which aren't usable yet. But then further on, more interaction from microbes, now you have nitrates, and that's the good stuff. That's what plants need. That's the fertilizer. And now what we do is, when we have at this point, now we go up to assimilation, where it's just drawn in by the plants and stored in their tissues. And it can be eaten by another animal, or it can die and decompose. That animal can die, decompose, or produce waste, specifically urine. And then we start over again, where the decomposers break it down. You get ammonification, which turns into ammonia and ammonium. And then you go back through nitrification and back up where we were. Now, at this point, you can also go through denitrification, where bacteria turn nitrates into gaseous nitrogen and reintroduce into the atmosphere, or it runs through again. Lightning, interestingly enough for this system, is a key player. And basically what happens is lightning is so powerful, so much energy is released in a bolt of lightning that it splits the nitrogen molecule, the N2 molecule, and now you have two nitrogen atoms, or ions, floating around, and they readily react with other compounds, namely oxygen, to produce nitrates and nitrites. So lightning, interestingly enough, helps this cycle along as well. Now, just like with the carbon cycle, humans have found a way to kind of mess with this and amplify it and make it different. Now, we can see that here. Burning of fossil fuels industrial settings will release nitrogen compounds into the atmosphere, and those get rained back down. It can be as nitric acid, which is then acid rain, which has a whole bunch of other problems. But then it gets into the soil this way, where it can be turned into ammonium and ammonia, and we go through. You can also add fertilizers, or these would be industrial or synthetic fertilizers that you can spray on fields, which work their way into the system. So now you're taking nitrogen that wasn't in the system and introducing more. So now there's more nitrogen at play, which would cause, in theory, more plant growth. But if you add too much, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. And in this case, fertilizers may cause more problems than solve in the long run. So humans will mess things up, or influence, I should say, just like they do in all the other systems. Okay, moving on from nitrogen, now let's take a look at phosphorus. The phosphorus cycle is the weirdest of the four that we're going to talk about. And that's because it is a significant limiting factor, because there is no atmospheric component. Phosphorus does not exist in the atmosphere at all. It is only found in the soils and rocks, and therefore it's only available in small quantities in a normal environmental setting. So the ecosystem is usually, plant growth is limited by the amount of phosphorus present. Nitrogen is omnipresent. Carbon is omnipresent. Phosphorus isn't. You can only add it to the system as quickly as it could be weathered out of the rocks and eroded away. And that's how the system usually works. So weathering occurs, you have plants, so it'll erode out, you get runoff into streams and rivers where it can enter into the waterway here, it dissolves in water where aquatic plants can take it up, or it precipitates out through decomposition or just precipitation and builds up in marine sediments where it enters the system again. You can have it for plants that take it in, they decompose, or animals will eat the plants and then they will decompose, and again, it gets leached out of their remains and works its way back into the aquatic system here, where it can be taken up by plants. So you need to be dissolved, really, to have this work the right way. Now humans, as you can see, sitting in the middle here, we have extraction. So we mine the stuff because we know it's a fertilizer. So we'll mine it and pull it out in large quantities and move it to other places that don't have a lot of phosphorus, which messes up things. Or you have the spraying again of synthetic fertilizers onto farm fields. And eventually that will work its way into the aquatic system, be taken up by plants and phytoplankton and microscopic algae, which, when we'll talk about later, can create significant problems for that aquatic system. So again, phosphorus is not available in the atmosphere. It's only available in sediments and in rocks, so we need to wait for it to weather out and leach out and be dissolved in water before the plants and therefore animals can take it up. All right, before we sign off, we've got one more cycle to look at. Okay, the water cycle. I'm not spending a lot of time on this because you have learned the water cycle since elementary school. It's the basics: evaporation, condensation, precipitation, runoff. Now, there are some smaller side categories and side processes that we have to keep in mind, such as sublimation and deposition, where we just go from liquid to a gas, where we go from a solid to a gas, or vice versa. We also have transpiration, so evapotranspiration, where plants give off water, and that's a significant source of water to the water cycle. Runoff and infiltration are important for what we have to study, because groundwater is important for not only plant and animal communities, but human communities as well. A lot of agriculture relies on groundwater, and understanding how groundwater works and is recharged is an important part of understanding environmental science. The main thing you have to understand is that this is powered by the sun and heat. The warmer things are and the more the sun's present, the more this system works. More evaporation, more precipitation, more runoff, and so on and so forth. With climate change, you're seeing places that got moderate rainfall sometimes may now start getting more significant rainfall events, more significant storms, flooding. That's just because we're adding more water into the system. So if we add more water into the atmosphere, more water needs to rain out. Oceans take up the primary reservoir of water on planet Earth. Most of Earth is covered in the oceans. The next one would be ice caps and glaciers, which hold the second place for storing water. A very small portion is actually liquid fresh water that you and I can drink readily. It's a small portion. So keep that in mind when you hear people about wasting water or see people wasting water. It really is a limited resource. To recap, productivity and ultimately biodiversity and the abundance of life dictate by the presence of these key macronutrients. The carbon cycle centers around the idea of photosynthesis and cellular respiration, or aerobic respiration. The nitrogen cycle requires microbes to turn atmospheric N2 into usable forms that plants, and therefore you and I, can use. Lightning also plays a role, but let's focus on the microbes because that's an important thing to understand. Phosphorus is the slowest moving and the most important in some ways because of that nutrient here, because there is no atmospheric component. It's only stored in rocks and sediments and in small amounts. You have to wait for them to weather out before plants can use them, and then therefore animals and us. And finally, the hydrologic cycle, and we didn't talk a lot about it there, but it's important. It's the simplest one because we've learned it for so long, but it's the one that really drives everything else. Without the water cycle, you don't get these nutrients moving through systems as quickly. If you don't have water, you don't have them moving through your body very quickly either. So even though the water cycle is so important and so ingrained in us and we've learned so much about it, it doesn't take away from how important it is to the other three and the other ones that we didn't talk about. Okay, so that does it for the nutrient cycles. We knocked out 4 different units in this one presentation. So until I see you next time, this is Mr. Langer signing off. Peace.